Hi, Nat Doig here. First of all, thank you for your patience in waiting for the next episode of Weird in the Wade, and it's here now. Before I start the episode, though, you may notice that the introduction is a little different. And also, just to give you a heads up that today's episode does include some descriptions of some rather gruesome deaths suffered by Christian saints. I bet that's got you intrigued. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. A podcast about all that's weird, wonderful, and a little off kilter in the town of Biggleswade, in Bedfordshire, and its surrounding area. Whether it's tales of phantom fighting men, the Potton Road poltergeist, haunting hounds, or the devil's toenail that you're after, or maybe a graveyard ghast, or eccentric character. Criminal conspiracies, or the Great Swan Mystery of 1935, which, yes, I promise I will tell you one of these days. Weird in the Wade will have something for you. The stories may be local, but they're never parochial, and will speak to you today, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. Late summer, 1742. Royston, Marketplace.
Get on with it, Jack, and stop your lollygagging,
Thomas moaned. All right. Keep your wig on, Thomas, Jack muttered.
What was that?
Nothing, it's just, I dunno. And Jack didn't know. He just had a bad feeling about today. The weather was fair, but he'd seen 3 jackdaws and a single magpie squabbling over something at the side of the road, something nasty, something dead, on his way to the butter market that morning. It had him on edge, thinking of darkness and secrets. The morbid sight thrust on him, a tension in his shoulders, a stiffness in his neck, a slinking sensation down his spine. Why does it have to be here? And why can't the milkmaids and the farmers' wives sit over there with the rest of us? He asked, as if it was what was bothering him. It wasn't. He couldn't care less where the women sat in the market.
Just get on with it,
Thomas barked. So Jack swung back his spade and he hit the ground with an almighty thud. He'd only intended to soften up the last bit of packed earth so that he could hammer in the posts for the bench more easily. And in his frustration, he'd smashed the spade down with such force he felt as if his arms and then his back had given way. He was falling forwards into the ground, only for his spade to hit something hard, harder than the earth around it. But then his spade slipped and seemed to get caught. He felt a great shudder through his whole body. That was it. He was convinced he was dying, slipping through the earth to hell. He called out in a bellow, "No!" Then he felt Thomas's rough hands pulling him upwards.
God's wounds, Jack! What have you done?
As it dawned on Jack that he hadn't died and wasn't descending to the fiery pit, he looked afresh at the earth in front of him, his body slouched with relief. His spade had struck deep into something far more solid than the earth, but then it had seemed to strike air. "There's a hole!" Jack exclaimed. "And it's not the one I dug. There's one below it." Thomas peered and retrieved with some little effort the spade. He gasped and then declared,
"No, it's not a hole as such. It's a millstone with a hole in it, you fool."
Jack, gathering his composure, asked, Well, what's a millstone doing there beneath the market cross? Neither of them knew, But Thomas must have thought it unusual, as he actually picked up a shovel and began to dig himself, uncovering the millstone so that it could be removed.
There's something below it. Or there isn't, if you get my meaning,
he exclaimed. After some little effort, and once the millstone was removed, Thomas bustled out of the way and started shouting orders to the people who'd gathered after hearing the commotion.
Get some light, fetch some spades, find a useful lad, small but sensible.
Jack meanwhile peered into the hole that the millstone had been covering, and there was a shaft of darkness going deep into the ground. He knew there were similar shafts and caverns dug into the chalk locally, used for cold storage, but some were ancient, it was said. Some, like this one, might contain secrets. Thomas would be thinking about treasure, Jack guessed. When wasn't he thinking about making money? But Jack did not like the look of this shaft at all. He did not think it would be treasure down there that they would find. No, not treasure. He shuddered and stepped away. Sam Chalkley was a useful boy of 10, helpful, polite and brave. He was also small for his age. Sam was employed as a general dog's body and occasional errand boy by the market. His ears were sharp, and his appetite for work might have been less keen than some, but he was always interested in something new or novel. So when he heard old Thomas Downham yelling about needing a boy to go into a hole, well, he couldn't resist. He reported for duty with a smile and a shake of his nut-brown hair. How difficult could this be, he told himself. Sam was led by Thomas Downham to the hole in the Buttermarket ground. Before looking into the hole, Sam noticed Jack Cooper, crouching a little way off, his face ashen. "Don't go in there, Sam."
Nonsense,
Thomas insisted.
Don't listen to Daft Jack.
As Thomas fiddled with the rope, tying it around Sam's waist, Sam listened to the folk gathered. Their talk made him fidget and twist even more.
Stop moving, Sam,
Thomas instructed. Sam stayed still but continued to listen. "It's a tunnel, I tell you. Summit to do with them old monks, if you ask me."
"No one is asking you, Myrtle,"
a gruff man's voice interjected.
"It's gonna just be a cellar entrance, that's all." It could be Roman. The Romans dug underneath their settlements, or so I've read,
said a stranger's voice.
"And I believe the Old North Road here is a Roman road."
"There could be treasure then, if it's that old. Roman coins," someone else shouted. "Don't go in there, Sam," Jack repeated. Thomas didn't reply this time, but instead squeezed Sam's shoulders and said,
"You're all set, my boy. This rope is tied securely, and we'll be holding it here, above ground. You just need to squeeze your way down through that shaft and then let us know what you see underneath. Understand?"
"Of course, sir." Someone had fetched a candle for Sam to use for light. A torch was held above him as he began his descent into the shaft. It cast jagged splinters of light, which his shadow mostly obscured, as he carefully felt for the sides of the shaft with his feet. At first, the shaft was tight around him, dark apart from the flickers at the edge of his vision from the candle in his trembling hand. He had to use his feet to steady himself and feel his way down. Every now and again, his toes would hit a hole and his heart would stop beating for a second, but then he'd find his grip again and continue. He was just getting used to the confinement of the dark shaft when its protection was no longer around him. His feet pedalled in the air below him, trying to find some grip, some purchase. He swung forward and found the edge again. His heart steadied and he paused for a while.
"What is it, Sam?"
Thomas shouted down. "The shaft! It's opened up into a cavern, sir. A cave." He began to edge his way down again. The dark down here began to swallow him as he moved away from the shaft opening. He could see a pool of light on the ground below him, so he knew there was a floor for him to land on. He shuddered with relief. It wasn't long until Sam's feet hit the ground again.
"What's down there?"
shouted Thomas. "Give me some more light," Sam pleaded, as Thomas's head blocked the torch and daylight from the top of the shaft. Sam looked around as the torchlight's flicker returned. He lifted his candle and he began to shout up his observations. It's like being inside a beehive. It's that shape above me, curved. The walls are chalky. This looks like someone made it like this. It's not like a cave at the seaside or the one Jesus was buried in. I've heard tell of those things and seen pictures. This doesn't look like them. There's indentations or little shelves in the wall. I put my feet in some of them on my way down. Some might be footholds, but some are big. Some might be for storing things. There's a great pile of earth below me, sir. Fine soil, ash and dust, it feels like. Oh, my Lord. There's a face. There's a face in the wall. A face looking at me. The crowd listening above gasped, and those further back asked what had the boy said? What had the boy seen? But Sam was unaware of all of that. He slowly approached the face he'd seen in the wall, the candle shaking in his hand. The earth underfoot was loose, making it tricky to step. He knew the face was just a picture, but all the same, it had shocked him. He had no idea that the crowd gathered above him were hanging on his every word, holding their breath. It's a picture, sir. A painting, but it's carved into the wall. It looks very peculiar. Not like the paintings in the bank or the corn exchange. It's like a figure in a stained glass window or a pamphlet about the Bible, but carved into the wall, into the chalk. There might be more of them, but I can only see the top of them. The dirt in here is blocking the rest. The dirt is covering up the bottom of the hole. Sam turned his attention to the pile of earth that he was standing on. He knew it wasn't the bottom of the chamber because he could only see the top of the figures' heads and faces that were carved around him. Throw me down a shovel. I'll dig away to see if I can reach the bottom of the cavern. A shovel and a lantern were sent down to him. Sam began to dig. He was only a few spadefuls in, nowhere near the bottom, when he saw it, gleaming in the lantern light, white against the dull grey of the dirt. White, but stained with yellow, unmistakable. It was bone, and a large domed piece of bone. As he began to scrape away the earth around it, now with his hands, he saw the familiar shape of a dark eye socket emerge. It was filled with a soft, dull dust. It was a skull, a human skull. Sam scuttled away from the skull, his stomach lurching. He was shaking. And now at a distance from it, he peered at the skull with a mixture of revulsion and fascination. He was stuck there staring, stuck in this hole with a skeleton.
What's happening, Samuel?
Thomas demanded, hearing that the digging had stopped. Sam took a deep breath and he yelled at the top of his lungs, "There's a body down here! There's a skeleton!" Welcome to Weird in the Wade. I'm Nat Doig, and today I'm going to take you along with me on a visit to Royston Cave, a mysterious cavern hewn by hand out of the chalk beneath the pretty Hertfordshire town of Royston. No one is quite sure when it was dug. It could be as old as pre-Roman, or it could be medieval, or anywhere in between. The cave was lost and forgotten for around 200 years, only to be rediscovered, as you heard in the dramatic introduction. I made up the names of those that were involved in its discovery because we don't know them, but the circumstances and the fact that the first person to enter the cave was a young boy is all true. Since its rediscovery, the cave has attracted interest from near and far. It has led to controversial and competing theories about the origin of the carvings and the purpose of the site. There has been local political upset in the 19th and 20th centuries about the management of the cave, and tales of the weird and uncanny have surrounded the site ever since that small boy was lowered down into its depths. In this episode, we're going to find out why. You'll hear from me, obviously, but at the cave, I was joined by Emma, the cave's custodian. Yes, that is her job title. It's a great job title, isn't it? Cave custodian. You'll also hear from Matt Champion, an archaeologist who has studied the cave extensively. And I also spoke with another Emma, this time on Zoom, who worked at a different cave, Mother Shipton's cave, but that's later in the episode. Royston lies about 15 miles southeast of Biggleswade as the crow flies, and in many ways is a similar town to Biggleswade. Both places grew up around important roads, but Royston was a crossroads before it was a town. The crossroads, once known as Roysia's Cross, was formed by the ancient pre-Roman Icknield Way, linking Buckinghamshire to Suffolk, and the Roman road, Ermine Street, which linked London to York. After the Romans departed Britain, Ermine Street continued to be used and became known as the Old North Road, until the 17th century when the Great North Road, the one going through and now around Biggleswade, took precedence. The Old North Road through Royston was the preferred route north to York from London. The crossroads and its associated stone cross was said to be named after Roysia, a woman who was married to one of William the Conqueror's noblemen. A monastery and a number of hospitals, including one for people with leprosy, were established near to this crossroads and the priory by the late 13th century. But at the time of the dissolution of the monasteries in the mid-16th century, Royston fell within 3 separate parishes and 2 counties. It had pretty much remained a medieval service station for travellers until that point. But in the mid-16th century, it was granted a market, and the town proper began to build up not just around the crossroads, but into the town that we know today. We'll come back to the rest of the town's history later, as it links with the history of the cave. But there is one other fact that I should tell you. In the early 16th century, we know that there was a hermit living at the crossroads. Mention of him appears in legal documents, which is why we know he was a man. We'll hear more about him later when we delve into the history of the cave. But let's head there now. Now recording, so we can go down into the cave. Okay, right, follow me down. I love all this though, the actual tunnel that was carved out is amazing.
This was dug out in 1790.
Yeah. It's amazing to think of them sort of, for the whole thing, carving it out.
Apparently the tunnel took 6 months.
The workmen did it over the winter, rebounding and short work.
That kind of makes sense. Oh wow. I'm coming into the actual cave itself, which you will probably hear from the echoing. And then there's one final step, isn't there? And then I'm on a wooden floor. And wow, it is shaped like a beehive. The reason I'm really here is to have a look at the carvings. And wow, they're everywhere. They are absolutely everywhere. I've been in quite a few churches recently looking at the church graffiti, and I've not seen anything quite like this. The cave that we're in is made of chalk, which is obviously very soft for carving, and that's why these figures are deeply carved. They're in relief. They're not like the sort of etched graffiti that I've looked at in churches. The first figure I concentrated on was that of St. Christopher. St. Christopher, you can see very clearly his leg. He seems to have a little mark on his leg, actually. He's wearing, I don't know, it looks like he's wearing like a skirt with a belt, but he doesn't have a top on. But maybe he's wearing that kind of tunic. It's hard to tell. And then he is holding on his shoulder a small boy who is Christ. His face, I love the expression on his face. He's got a long nose, pointed chin, that very sort of oval face that you see in medieval art. And he actually looks like it's not too much of a feat to be carrying the world and Jesus on his shoulders.
Well, I think first of all you have to kind of acknowledge it's not great art. A lot of this carving is really, really quite crude, and they are pretty generic. So when you talk about the expression on some of these faces, I think sometimes it could be the result of reworking, but a lot of the time I think we're reading it in there. Some of these, if you look further along the row, there's really not much of a face. No, it's what possibly is a nose and a couple of eyes and maybe a mouth. And whether that mouth is pointing up or down makes it look as though it's happy or grumpy. And some of them, particularly at this end, look as though they were never really completed as well.
Oh, they do. It's like a head just floating there. Yeah.
So I wonder if this was not a kind of constant work in progress. You start off with the big figures and then you add the other ones as you're kind of going along, and it does feel in many areas as though they're fitting bits in the gaps.
Yeah.
So there are clear areas where you look at St Christopher and it's very, very deep relief carving, and they've removed the chalk on one side to a far greater depth than they have on the other side. And then as you move around, you'll see these panels almost where they've removed the chalk. So over further to the left, you've got Christ on the cross, and that's absolutely been carved very, very deeply. So they've removed all the chalk on all the way around it. So it really is, standing out in high relief.
Yeah. We know that the cave was newsworthy almost immediately on its discovery, thanks to articles which appear in many newspapers at the time, including the Newcastle Courant, which on Saturday the 16th of October 1742 declared, "We hear from Royston that a few days since a cave 30 foot deep was accidentally found." They describe its shape and the carvings found within it. In my own copy of A Guide to the Counties of Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire from 1805, this is what is said about the cave. In the August of 1742, some workmen were driving a post into the ground to support a bench for the market women in the marketplace. They accidentally discovered a perpendicular opening which communicated with a kind of subterranean oratory, which has been dug out of the chalk. The opening into this singular cave, when first discovered, had holes cut into the side to assist the persons descending. This opening was, however, soon enlarged through the impatience of the town people, who expected to discover some hidden treasure and were anxious to get the clay expeditiously cleared out of the crypt, which was found to contain about 200 loads of rubble. In return for all this trouble and expense, they had only the satisfaction of finding the decaying fragments of a human skeleton. The internal structure of this singular excavation is extremely curious. Its form is circular and its roof was finished after the manner of a dome, in the centre of which was the entrance we have already noted. Rude sculptures representing the crucifixion and other similar scenes occupy the lower part of the sides, and round the whole runs a raised seat of about a foot in height, from 2 to 3 feet wide, interrupted only upon the east by a cavity, commonly called the grave. Just to say that the description of rude sculptures doesn't mean that they are rude in the sort of sense that we use today. It means that they were basic or rustic in nature. From Thomas Watson's time onwards, and he was the chap who in 1790 made the tunnel entrance we now use into the cave. The cave has been in the care of a custodian who originally lived in Cave House where the tunnel begins. Newspaper articles at the time encourage visitors, saying of the cave, and I quote, "It can be seen any time, night or day." By the late 1880s, G. Poole, a bootmaker, is the custodian. He advertises his boot business alongside visits to the cave. I love this idea of Victorians, going in to buy themselves some new riding boots or boots for work, and at the same time they get to have a trip down a cave. The lease of the house and role of custodian are advertised periodically throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. In 1913, the lease of the house, shop and cave was advertised at £30 per annum. A William Lee had left the cave and its associated buildings to the town council in the 19th century. And in the 1890s, there is some discontent in Royston about where the money raised by cave tourism is being spent. So in 1891, a charity is formed, and the proceeds from cave visits are used locally for, and I quote, the education of women and girls training to be nurses, invalids at home or in hospital on a temporary basis, emigration for passage or outfits. It's fascinating to me that charities at the time were encouraging local working and poor people to leave the country by paying for their emigration passage or fancy clothes to wear on the journey. In 1892, though it may have appeared in earlier editions, the cave is listed in Bradshaw's Railway Guide, showing that Royston Cave had officially made it as a Victorian tourist destination. The cave's popularity continued throughout the 20th century. A popular set of books and newspaper column called I Spy from the 1940s until the 60s, which awarded readers points for visiting various places of local interest across the UK, has Royston Cave scoring visitors 40 points if they visit. What really fueled this tourism was not just the peculiarity of the cave and its unusual discovery, but the ongoing debate about why it was made, who by, what the carvings mean, and how it had been used in the past. The first antiquarian to visit was a Reverend George North of Caldecott, and I think that's the Caldecott that's very close to Royston, not the one that's nearer to Biggleswade. He was requested to visit by the Society of Antiquaries, and he was there so soon after the cave's discovery that the townsfolk were yet to reach the bottom of the cave in their excavations. They were about 8 feet off from completion, yet at this stage North noted that they had already found the skeleton. He drew pictures and sent his report to the Society. Within a month of Reverend North's visit, Dr. William Stukely arrived and was the first to write extensively about the cave. Stukely is a fascinating South Lincolnshire man who is mostly associated nowadays with his work at Stonehenge, but within months of the cave's discovery, Stukely was studying it.
As an antiquarian, he was a very good observer.
Yeah, he was.
And he was one of the first to point out that the iconography in the cave, there was a pattern to it. His drawings were not foolproof. No. But he was pretty observant, and he made the right observations. Mm-hmm. I suppose he's a proto-archaeologist, really. Yeah. He's one of the great antiquarians of the middle decades of the 18th century. Mm-hmm. He was a fellow, one of the founding fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of London. He got everywhere. And he was fairly prolific in his publication. So he looked at places like Avebury and Stonehenge, but he was one of the first people to examine this site as well. But I think the people who looked at it, particularly in the 18th century through to the 19th, all the way through to our local hero like Beldam, they really knew that this site was different. They knew it was important, and they took the time to record what was here. And they were skilled in their own way. So we've been very lucky.
Stukely's theory was that the cave was ancient, but that the cave's carvings were medieval and had been carved as a private chapel and then resting place for Lady Roysia, who Royston was named for. So dating the cave carvings back to the 11th or 12th century in his theory. He referred to the depression in the floor of the cave as the grave, though it was clearly not where the human skeleton was found. Stukely's interpretation was almost immediately challenged by other antiquarians, most notably Charles Parkin, who instead theorised that it was the cave of a wayside hermit. In the mid-19th century, a local anti-slavery campaigner turned antiquarian, Joseph Beldam, embarked on a study of the cave. His publication opens with this delightful summing up of the last 100 years of mystery and conjecture surrounding the site. More than a century has elapsed since a fortunate accident led to the discovery of one of the most interesting specimens of antiquity possessed by this or any other country, the Royston Cave. So great was the curiosity occasioned by this singular occurrence that it immediately gave rise to a warm controversy between two eminent archaeologists of the day,
Dr. William Stukely and the Reverend Charles Parkin, in the course of which, though both parties displayed abundant learning and ingenuity, the cause of truth suffered much from their mutual loss of temper and the too eager desire on both sides to establish a rival theory. You can read Beldam's full work on Royston Cave online, and I really do recommend it. It's a fascinating read, and I'll link to it on the show blog at weirdinthewade.blog. After chiding his fellow antiquarians for their disputes, Beldam sided with Parkin, and after some very nifty research, discovered that in the time of Henry VII, 1506 to be precise, a hermit had died at Royston, leaving money. Beldam quite rightly says that this does not prove that the hermit lived in that cave, or our cave, but he felt it was highly unlikely that there was more than one hermit in the town. Now, Royston's curious parish boundaries at the time also narrowed down where this hermit had died, and it put him in the right side of the town for the cave. Beldam also goes on to make a plausible argument for why the cave was covered up and forgotten about. Within 30 years of this hermit's death, we have the dissolution of the monasteries, and around about that same time, a market is granted to Royston, and a merket or market cross was erected over the site of the cave. These structures were not crosses as such, but tall buildings with open arches on the ground floor for the market, and a central structure used in the case of Royston as a clock tower and a town lockup or jail. This was in a time before police and police stations, and many towns had these kind of makeshift town lockups. Beldam's theory so far aligns with that of modern researchers and archaeologists like Matt.
Well, first of all, the origins of this cave, it's been here a long time. We don't know exactly how long. One of the theories is it goes back to at least the Roman period.
Wow.
The evidence is now kind of gone, so we're never going to know that. All we can say is that most historians, since this was rediscovered in the 1740s, have generally tended to agree that this is probably a hermitage, and that this was the site of a late medieval or early 16th century hermit, and that these carvings were done as acts of devotion, essentially. Interestingly, in the case of this particular site, is we do have written documentary evidence for a hermit locally as well. Now, in the later Middle Ages, hermits were quite different from anchorites who lived a solitary life. Hermits tended to live more in the community, and they often had sort of community roles. And one of those roles, which we've got a lot of documentary evidence for, is looking after things like causeways, bridges, and in particular roads. There's a lot of late medieval hermits are involved in road mending and road repair. And if you were going to have a hermitage somewhere around here, then at one of the most important crossroads in the immediate area, this would be the place.
Yeah, that makes sense. But what Beldam, and it seems just about everyone before and after him, still debate is the nature and the depictions within the carving. Although most are agreed that these carvings are medieval, who they depict and at which period they were carved has long been debated. Beldam placed them in the period of Richard the Lionheart and the Crusades, which would mean they were carved in around the second half of the 12th century. Some of his interpretations of who is presented in the carvings are really quite extraordinary, including identifying one very prominent and ambiguous carving that I will refer to later as Rave Man, as that of the Scottish king William the Lion. The carvings in the cave dominate the lower half. Basically, they're as high as an average person could reach without a ladder. These carvings are generally of figures, but there is a horse, and we'll come on to that later, and some other shapes, which some are recognisable, such as swords, for example, and others which can be debated. Then over, on and above these figures are much newer marks and initials, names and other characters etched into the chalk. But we will look at this, the graffiti, in a moment. Some of the original carved figures in the cave have been identified pretty unambiguously and unanimously agreed on. Even I recognised who they were depicting. So let's have a look at the carvings and head back into the cave.
And then we have a lovely figure of St. Catherine.
I love her. Yes, we know it's St. Catherine because she's holding a wheel.
Yeah.
It looks almost like she's got a crown on her head.
She has got a crown on her head, quite a distinctive crown.
Lovely. Is there a reason for that? Does she normally have a crown?
In late medieval art, a crown is usually worn by either a royal saint or a martyr.
Right.
So, and Catherine was one of the martyrs.
Yes.
The crown itself really is quite distinctive, and it's one of the features, along with the costume and a few other things, that allow us to sort of more precisely pin down the date of a lot of these carvings. But it does feel as though this is not, someone hasn't come in here with a plan and a design and said, I'm going to do this scheme.
Yeah.
It feels like there's been a lot added over time. So it's not like we've just got one crucifixion scene.
No.
Actually, if you look below it and a little to the left, we've got a second one that's smaller.
Yeah.
And there's another one on the other side as well. So we end up with these multiple scenes.
Okay, if we move around and have a look at some of the other carvings.
This, we think, is St. Lawrence, holding the gridiron.
Oh, yes. I don't know about St. Lawrence. That's one saint that I'm afraid I don't know about.
He's another of our Christian martyrs. He was roasted on a gridiron.
Oh,
so
lovely.
Particularly gruesome way to go.
Yeah. He supposed to save the money and holy relics from Rome before it was ransacked. So he lends into the Holy Grail myth.
Yes.
He was supposed to have sent, it was the chalice, the Holy Chalice, he was supposed to have sent it for safekeeping to Spain when Rome was ransacked.
Okay.
So we do get a lot of visitors that are
Who want to
interested
see
in
him,
that
yeah.
conspiracy theory about the bloodline of Jesus.
We're getting into Dan Brown
yes.
territory here. So if we move around from St. Lawrence holding his massive gridiron, I mean, it does look like he is basically holding a grill pan or a griddle above his head.
He's a patron saint of cooks.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
And comics.
Yeah.
Oh, and comics.
Because apparently when they lifted him up, he said something like, I'm not finished yet, turn me over, or something like that.
Oh, typical, yeah. So he had the good one-liner. Yeah, fantastic. One of the issues which led Beldam astray with some of his interpretations of who is carved on the walls relates to the graffiti in the cave and when and who added it. By Beldam's time, the cave and the original carvings in it were smothered in graffiti, including names and initials. This is why Beldam ends up identifying one of the carvings as King William the Lion of Scotland. This was because across the figure's chest is carved the letters W.R., which Beldam thought could refer to William Rex, the Scottish crusading king. To modern researchers, it's clear that the W.R. scrawled across this figure's chest is far more recent than the original carving. It is most likely the initials of an early tourist to the cave. But so many of these more recent additions or graffiti are interpreted in mystical or highly unlikely ways, as Matt explained.
So it's about Occam's razor. Okay, what is the most likely explanation? Is it some weird Cathar secret symbol in a place underneath Royston Crossroads, or is it one of the visitors, along with all the other visitors who've left their initials? Right. And what's really interesting about this as well with these post-medieval ones is that, they were custodians. They had to come down here with someone.
Right.
So they were clearly doing the graffiti in front of the custodian, and they have absolutely no issues with it.
Why do you think that was? That's the thing that fascinates me, is that why in the late 18th, 19th century were people being brought down here, like you say, they had to come with the custodian.
Yeah.
Did they maybe even encourage people to basically graffiti over the carvings?
I think it's about our changing attitudes towards graffiti. Mm-hmm. We see graffiti today as something that's bad, and that's really quite modern. So our attitude towards graffiti only really starts to change in about 1850. And that coincides with when we start to change our attitudes towards heritage. So if you look at our buildings prior to about 1850, our castles, churches, caves, whatever, they're absolutely covered in graffiti, and no one seems to have any problem with that whatsoever. From about 1850 onwards, we start to value these sites as something more. We start to see them as more than just picturesque ruins. We start to see them as, the heritage of this country. And from that point forward, people start to look down upon the idea of leaving graffiti inscribed there. If you go back to the Middle Ages, we know they have absolutely no issues whatsoever leaving graffiti on churches, cathedrals, castles, whatever. Interestingly, from our perspective, of course, is 1850 also marks the beginning of the word graffiti. Graffiti is a made-up word, and it's made up by archaeologists to describe the Roman inscriptions them finding at Pompeii. So, and when they first use this word, when they first invent this word to describe these informal inscriptions, it's got no negative connotations whatsoever. It's a purely descriptive term. So, as I say, prior to 1850, they have absolutely no issue with it. So, I think when these are being done, if you think back to the 1740s when the first visitors are here, they don't have any issue with it. It's a historical curiosity. It's not an ancient monument. And so they're being encouraged to leave their own mark here as well. We'd never dream of doing it today. But it's this idea that there's a paradox with our view of graffiti. And we continue to this day. It's when we start talking about graffiti, and graffiti is a bad thing, or unless it's Banksy. He can come and leave a mural in my house any time. I'll have that covered in perspex and off to an auction house. Yeah. But it's also, we don't have a clear view of graffiti. So if you came down into this cave and left your name on the wall, people might be quite annoyed with you. If you had come down 100 years ago, it would be a bit of a curiosity. If you come down 200 years ago, the guides would point it out. Yeah. So it's partly about age. It becomes, it's seen as more interesting based purely upon how old it is. But it's not that simple. So if you'd come down here in the 1960s and left your name on the wall and your name happened to be Paul McCartney or John Lennon, then that would also be pointed out to the guides. So it's a bit of a paradox, really. And we still have issues with our own attitudes towards graffiti because we can't decide what it is. Is it good? Is it bad? Does it depend on the context? The problem is that there's been a lot of erosion on the surface as well. So we're only ever seeing... What we're seeing today is a composite, and it's made up of hundreds of years of graffiti. So it's not a single scheme, as it were. Right. The stuff that's been added to it since it's been reopened in the 1740s is, from a social history perspective, just as important. It's telling a really interesting story about early tourism in the UK, which is not something we ever talk about. But stylistically, most of our figures, these ones, so this is St Catherine. What Stukely did point out absolutely correctly is that the iconography of the main figures here, so our St Catherine, our St George, our St Christopher, it ties in very nicely with the sort of iconography you would see in a typical medieval church. Now, the only difference here is it's reversed. So we're actually at the West End here. And Stukely suggested there may well have been a freestanding cross or something here. And to be honest, given the imagery and the way it's all located, and you've got these figures here, I think they may well have been correct.
Now, I said we'd get back to the carving which Beldam described as possibly being William the Lion, the Scottish crusading king. Well, this carving is very prominent when you walk into the cave. And one of the other theories is that it depicts King David from the Old Testament. But he has this carving attracted his fair share of graffiti. He is smothered in it. And so I really did want to talk about the impression that gave me and why I thought he should be called Rave Man.
The thing that I find really interesting looking at these figures now, particularly the one that could be King David, could be Jesus being crucified, could be another martyr, is because they've got all the graffiti on them, they look like they're tattooed. So from a modern eye, he actually looks really modern. He could be a man at a rave, with his arms in the air, dancing, covered in tattoos.
Well, that's our new interpretation then.
Yeah,
rave man.
He's rave man. And actually, as we were saying earlier, we probably will never know who he was meant to be, unless we get a time machine and we can go back to the person that carved him. So yeah, our new interpretation, because we may never know, is he's rave man. He's the man that's covered in tattoos, dancing joyously. Having a rave in the cave. I mean, it would be an amazing place to come down and listen to music, because the acoustics are just wonderful.
The acoustics are amazing.
Yeah.
I think it is the problem we've got with a lot of these carvings now, is that we're relying on antiquarian drawings, some very early photographs, and when you compare even the early photographs with what we're seeing now, there have been significant losses, in recent centuries, and that will continue to happen. So a lot of the surface detail has gone. In the case of our rave man figure, the lower half of the figure is entirely gone. Yeah. If there ever was a lower half of the figure. So a lot of these are always going to be open to interpretation. If you look at the top of his crown, someone has sheared off the top of the crown at an angle as well, probably when creating one of the other carvings.
Yeah. Yeah, the one above.
It's not just the graffiti which has led to controversy and accusations of misinterpretation of the carvings and their origin. In some cases, theories that were put forward based on evidence available at the time have since been reassessed by researchers. Yet the pull of some of these theories is like a riptide through time that the cave cannot escape. One of these theories relates to the Knights Templar. Before we look at the evidence in and outside of the cave relating to the Templars, we need to know who they were. I have to say, if you mention the Knights Templars to me, a few things pop into my head. Monty Python, obviously, and the knights who say "Nee!" But probably most prominent in my mind is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Not a week goes by when I don't witheringly say, "He chose poorly," in response to a bad decision someone has made. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go and watch Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. You will not regret it. And finally, of course, when it comes to the Knights Templar, Dan Brown. Yes, I read the Da Vinci Code and its predecessor, Angels and Demons, which I actually preferred. My associations demonstrate that those of us of a certain age grew up with the Templars, or ciphers for them, being part of our pop culture, which is quite a feat considering that the Knights Templar died out in the 14th century. For most of us of a certain age, the Knights Templar are kind of there on the fringe of our understanding. Maybe we know that they related to the Crusades, maybe even the search for the Holy Grail. They mysteriously disappeared as an order, or in the works of Dan Brown, the Knights Templar somehow went underground and ended up running the world as part of some kind of shadowy cabal. But, as is always the case, the history of the Knights Templar is more interesting in many ways than the rumours and the myths. I'm not going to take a deep dive into Templar lore. I do recommend the episode on BBC Sounds of In Our Time about the Knights Templar, as well as the episode of A Short History of, which is also about the Knight Templars, if you want to know more about them. So I'll post links on the blog to both of those podcasts, which you can listen to on BBC Sounds. But in brief, the Knights Templar were a warrior monk order formed in France in 1118 by a knight named Hugh de Pan. And I thought it was spelt like the bread, like he was Hugh de Baguette, but it isn't. It's Payen. Now, strictly speaking, they weren't monks. They weren't in holy orders as such, but Hugh modelled their structure on that of monastic orders. Members of the Knights Templar had to be celibate, take an oath of poverty, and live by strict rules. They were formed as a militia to protect Western Christians taking pilgrimages to the Holy Land, as well as being involved in the ongoing crusades in the Middle East. They were recognised by the Pope, and their name of Templar related to the headquarters in Jerusalem, which was at Solomon's Temple. Basically, if you were wealthy enough in the 12th century, you could hire them to protect you as you journeyed to and from and around the Holy Land. Although the Templars took an oath of poverty, they dealt with huge sums of money as they managed the coffers for the pilgrims, as well as earning money from them. They were also bequeathed large areas of land and soon became one of the wealthiest organisations in Christendom. Some even argue that they were the first international corporate organisation moving goods, people and finances around Europe and the Middle East. Their downfall came after 200 years, with a couple of failed battles in the Crusades, and also the fact that they failed to work well with rival orders like the Knights Hospitallers. King Philip IV of France and Pope Clement V felt that the order now had too much money, land and power. Henry and Clement concocted false allegations against the Templars and decreed that they were banned. These allegations centred around corruption, worshipping false idols, carrying out witchcraft and unchristian rituals, and all the usual aspersions thrown at monks through the ages, including that they were holding orgies and basically were debauched. In France, the Templars' leader Jacques de Molay and many other Templars were rounded up, tortured and executed. But why would the Templars be active in Britain? I've only really talked about France and the Middle East. Some English knights had joined the order, and many noblemen supported them and used their services, including bequeathing land to them. It just so happens that in Baldock, just a few miles away from Royston, there was considerable property owned by the Knights Templars, and they were based there in Baldock. Now, it was Sylvia Beeman, a local historian, archaeologist and author, who put forward the Templar theory. Sylvia had been visiting Royston Cave since the late 1960s and was determined to unlock its secrets. Sylvia found records showing that there had been a disagreement between Royston Priory and the Templars at Baldock after some knights were arrested and imprisoned by the monks, showing that the knights must have been in Royston on business of some kind. Sylvia thought she was onto something. And although the carvings in the cave had been linked to the Crusades by Stukely and others, the link to the Knights Templar was not seized upon by the public until Sylvia's theories were published in the 1990s. There is one very unique piece of evidence in the cave which those who believe in the links to the Knights Templar cite as a smoking gun. It has featured prominently in a short section of an episode of the History Channel's The Curse of Oak Island, where they visit Royston Cave. Now, I could go down a separate rabbit hole or side quest all about Oak Island and why the TV show came to Royston, but to be brief, Oak Island is an island off the Atlantic coast of Canada, just off Nova Scotia. Now, there are rumours swirling around Oak Island that there is a treasure buried there by a pirate. Strange and unique items have been found on the island, and there are various pits and shafts which have been excavated but have also flooded over the last 2 centuries. I was surprised to learn that one theory pursued in the TV show was that the Knights Templar had visited the North Atlantic coast of Canada back in the 12th or 13th century and had left artefacts and carvings behind. So that's why the TV crew turned up at Royston Cave. Now, I will post a link to where you can watch that section on YouTube. And actually, it's a really good illustration of what the cave is like, what it's like going into the cave. I definitely recommend you watch it. I'm not sure what I think about their theories about Oak Island. It's not something I know about. But as far as watching it to see what the cave is like, it is brilliant. The piece of evidence in the cave that really cinched it for the Oak Island crew, that there was a link between the 2 sites and the Templars, is a date carved into the bricks at the top at one of the cave's shafts.
And that's where, it's actually on those painted clad blocks, is where we've got our date.
That one.
Yeah.
Which is easy to see without the light on it.
It is. Unfortunately, it wasn't there when the cave was discovered.
Well, Stukely never saw it, but...
He would have had to be, his nose would have been inches away from it. There wasn't just Stukely. The first people who recorded it, including Green. Here we have a nice, clear 14th century date. Unfortunately, it's in Arabic, very modern Arabic numerals, and it wasn't recorded by any of the original visitors to the cave.
Some people think originally it was 1547, and that it's been changed into a 3, but you think even that's unlikely.
And it still wasn't there.
Right.
So when Stukely was here, when Green were here, it wasn't.
Helpfully for us, Joseph Beldam in the mid-19th century had access to the writings and images made by both Stukely and Reverend North of Caldecott about this area of the roof in 1742 when the cave was newly discovered. This is what Beldam said.
Dr. Stukely, who saw it only from the bottom and by candlelight, merely adverts to the piece of masonry visible near the top, which they who viewed it near, he says, told him was made of brick, tile and stone, laid in good mortar, and thought it might have been done to mend a defective part in the chalk. Mr. North, who made his observations before the cave was emptied, and therefore from a higher level, remarks that a portion of the dome had been either repaired or strengthened with the free stone and tiles, placed edgeways, and that almost opposite the shaft through which he entered, there appeared to be the top of an arch. The date is so clear today that even I could see it against the brick. So I am certain if it was there in the times of North, Stukely and Beldam, they would have certainly mentioned it, as Matt said. I'm guessing the date of 1347 was in place when Sylvia was inspecting the cave. And we'll come back to these additions that people have made to the cave beyond usual graffiti later in the episode. But it wasn't just the date that set Sylvia on her path to the Knights Templar theory. She also identified a couple of the carvings within the cave as depicting Jacques de Molay, the last leader of the Knights Templar, being burnt at the stake. Now, Sylvia based this on some other carvings in various places in France, which at the time were thought to be associated with the Knights Templar. However, history evolves.
If you look at one of these stories, like the Knights Templar, it's very, very recent. It's only been around since the 1990s. Mm-hmm. But because it's been something that people want to believe in, it's got to the stage that despite the fact that every other historian has turned around and said that's very, very unlikely, and we've agreed on what we think this is as a hermitage since it was rediscovered in kind of 1742, that story has now taken precedence to the extent that, despite there being no direct evidence for it, it now actually turns up on the Historic England listing document.
Oh, yes, I did see that.
Yeah. So these, all history and all these sites, they do evolve, as does our understanding of them and our emotional connection to them. Yes. And the emotional connection is just as important.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's the thing that's really important. We can look at the evidence and be very pragmatic about, and as we have been, saying that actually there's some bits we will never know because we didn't get the chance to do the scientific testing on it when it was first uncovered. Yeah. But it is still fascinating to see what people bring with them to the cave and what they enjoy and the emotional connection with it. I would much rather, as a historian, have people coming and engaging with a piece of history like this than not.
What I find particularly fascinating is that even though the evidence no longer leads us to the Knights Templar, so many people do not want to give up on that theory. The pull of the Templars in popular culture is so strong that I doubt the cave will ever shake it off. And hey, I'm happy to add to the speculation somewhat lightheartedly. If you turned Royston Cave upside down, it resembles a goblet or chalice, like a holy grail maybe. Just saying. King James VI of Scotland and First of England is one of my favourite monarchs. James did have connections to Royston. It was one of his favourite hunting grounds, and you can still see what they call the palace, which was his hunting lodge in Royston. And you've guessed it, there are rumours that King James used Royston Cave as a Masonic lodge. So I asked Matt if there was any truth in that rumour.
If this had been accessible to the public in the late 16th and early 17th century, I think first of all we'd be seeing some graffiti from that period. Mm-hmm. We're not. And I think we'd see a lot of destruction on some of these more obviously religious images. I think we have to assume, based upon what we've seen with the iconography and the history of the cave, It's sealed at some point at the beginning in the first decades of the 16th century, and it remains sealed until it's rediscovered in August 1742. So James quite possibly may have ridden over this site many times, but probably didn't know it was here.
No.
Before I explore what we definitely know is true about Royston Cave and what remains a mystery, I thought I'd delve into why caves have that spiritual or otherworldly pull on us. So I spoke with podcaster and author Emma Butler, who has the unique insight, having worked in another very famous British cave, that of Mother Shipton.
I personally am quite scared of caves, but I also really like going into them. And I think there's that certain amount of facing your fears type of thing. But also they're like this hidden place that's just beneath our feet. Like we can be out in the sunshine, it's all a lovely day and everything's normal. Then you just like walk 10 feet and you're in this dark, mysterious place and you don't know where anything is and the world seems very far away. It's just like this hidden corner of our world. It's this hidden space. It's a liminal space, really.
Am I right in thinking you worked at Mother Shipton's cave in Yorkshire?
Yes, I was a tour guide there in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And my job was to show people, I mean, there's quite a lot connected with the cave, but my job was to show people around the cave, tell a story of Mother Shipton and all the things around it, like the petrifying well, the wishing well, and so on. It was a really busy area for things happening, and there were lots of stories to be told around it. It's the oldest tourist attraction in England, I think.
I suppose, first of all, what are the facts that we know about Mother Shipton, who she was and why she was associated with a cave?
Well, the facts are a bit funny because there's the facts I was told as a tour guide, and then recently I listened to a podcast from After Dark.
Yeah.
I went through the facts and they had an entirely different set of facts. So the facts are a bit, fuzzy. But what I was told is that she was born Ursula Southwell and that her mother, as a teenager, was pregnant and she had nowhere to go to give birth. And it was the middle of a raging storm and she found herself by the River Nid in Knaresborough, about to give birth all by herself. And she stumbled into this cave and gave birth to Ursula there. And we were told that the story was the devil was there watching her, but, they say that with every story. And she gave birth to this baby, and we were always told, and I hated having to say this, we were always told she was a very ugly baby. I know, very cruel, but this was the 80s. Yeah, and she lived there for a few years, and then she left and she went to live in York, Knaresborough. They seem to be not quite sure where she lives. But Ursula grew up, and as a teenage girl, she began to have visions. She could tell the future. One of the things she foretold when Wolsey was made Archbishop of York, she said, he will see York, but he will never visit it. And the story was that Wolsey got far enough to see the towers of York, and then was called back by King Henry.
Yeah.
And so therefore he saw York but never visited it. She got married to somebody called Toby Shipton, I think, which is why she's called Mother Shipton. She apparently had lots of gentlemen callers. I'm not sure of the phrase she would have used, but she was apparently a very popular young woman, despite being, obviously, as a witch should be, very ugly. And she was kind of like known for being able to see the future, for being able to tell fortunes, that sort of thing. And she was very good at it. And she did tell a prophecy about the end of the world, which is that when the World's End Bridge in Knaresborough fell down 3 times, that was the end of the world. Now, when I was doing this tour, the World's End Bridge had already fallen down twice. So we gave this tour to some local councillors, and the very next day, there were workmen on the bridge strengthening the bridge. So,
fantastic.
Stories still have weight. We were told that she lived to a good old age, and that when she died, she was buried in York in the same graveyard as Dick Turpin.
Oh, yes, I know.
I'm not sure if that's... Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know the one.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that's true or not. It probably isn't, but it was a really good story. Dick Turpin and Mother Shipton buried side by side in the same graveyard. And that was the basic facts, as we were told when we were given the tour. But then we was give atmosphere. We also had to tell people that although she was supposed to have made prophecies like the world will come to an end in 1881, something like that, She didn't actually say that. What happened is that a bunch of students found her story and they made up prophecies as a joke, and they got attributed to her even though they weren't true. And I always found this interesting that you had this powerful female witch who knew things, and a bunch of students who would have been them just decided to say, oh no, she made it up, and here's all these rubbish prophecies she made, so obviously she's a fake. And I was always so angry with the students because they were tainting the memory of her accomplishments.
What I find really fascinating after listening to Emma's story is how two very different caves in different parts of the country can still have a history which is disputed and evolving as we learn more. I, too, feel quite cross at those students for messing around with history, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Why do people mess around with history? Finally, another more recent theory or belief about the cave is that it is situated on the Michael and Mary ley line, which is said to run from St Michael's Mount at the tip of Cornwall, through the standing stones known as the Hurlers, and Avebury's stone circle, through Royston Cave and on to Bury St Edmunds. Now, belief in ley lines and their power is a matter of faith, in my opinion. I'm not going to argue here whether they exist or they don't. But what is clear is that many people now visit Royston Cave because they believe it is an ancient, even if the carvings aren't, site, and that they feel a strong spiritual connection with it and within it. Just as whoever carved those Christian iconography on its walls also felt a connection to a faith, that of the Christian faith. Although I found the cave quite calming and womb-like, not everyone, though, has the same response. Listener and friend Fliss had a very different reaction to the cave.
We went to Royston Caves it was a regular open day, normal weather, not too hot, not too cold, although down in the caves there is a distinct damp chill. We had been there about 10 to 15 minutes when I very suddenly began to feel unwell. Doesn't really cover it, because it was a strange mixture of feeling faint, nauseous, full of dread, but also this strong sense of needing to get out of those caves. Now, I'm not at all claustrophobic. I've been on tours of caves and underground spaces before and since, and not felt like that. And as soon as I went back above ground, I felt okay again. And I didn't go back down afterwards, just to be on the safe side.
And Fliss is not alone in feeling uncomfortable down there. There have been reports over the last 200 years of dark shadows flitting through the cave. Some have said that they have seen the likenesses of monks in there. But sadly, there is very little detail about these ghostly sightings. If you've had a haunting experience in Royston Cave, I would love to hear from you. What can we be certain about when it comes to Royston Cave? One certainty is that we'll never have all the answers, not unless someone invents a time machine. The layers of graffiti, the continued erosion of the cave, and the lack of forensic and archaeological understanding when the cave was excavated all mean many mysteries will remain. What is also certain is that the cave means so much to so many different people, and that cannot be underestimated.
I think that's a key part of it. These sites evolve. Yeah. Not only our sort of understanding as historians, but also the way people react to them.
Yes.
You know, history is all about people. Yeah. It's all about how people interact with their environment. You know, it just so happens some of them are dead.
Yes.
But our reaction to the sites like this is just as important. Oh, I think when we look at the cave and we look at the way it's structured, I think we're seeing great similarities between the imagery there and the imagery that you would see in your average medieval church. So it is setting it aside as a place that is holy. The imagery would have been part of the late medieval landscape. Anyone who went to church would have seen those same images painted on the walls. They would have seen the same images carved in alabaster. They would even, as pilgrims, be buying pilgrim badges with that same imagery that they could carry around with them as a, an amulet or talisman. So it really just is, it's part of the late medieval landscape of belief. And the imagery in the cave, it's not unique. The cave is, and the amount of graffiti there and the amount of carvings is, but the imagery isn't. That's exactly what we'd expect to see from that period.
So we're talking, in a way, medieval memes.
Absolutely medieval memes. And anyone who would have looked at that imagery would have recognised it for what it is.
Yeah.
There is another mystery connected with the cave that intrigues me. I am fascinated to know when, how, and why the various pieces of alteration were made to the cave. Not the graffiti by the visitors in the 18th and early 19th century. That is really interesting. But no, I mean, who etched that date of 1347 into the brick? And it's not just the date that was added. Listen to this.
What we can do is point out where things have been changed because we've got early photographs.
Right.
So our wonderful shield in the gig,
Yeah.
if you go back to the original drawings and the original photographs, isn't a shield in the gig.
Oh, okay.
So someone, it's got like just like these, it's actually got a kind of skirt on place.
Oh, so the way Stickley drew it, because in his drawings he's got a little skirt on it.
Yeah.
And we were told that was just his, modesty skirt.
No.
That this was.
If you look at the early photographs, it's also got a skirt as
I'm
well.
going to go back and see if I can find it.
So,
So that was never.
now someone has altered it, but we've had alterations on quite a lot of these.
Yeah. So if we just move around the cave, is that an animal? Because I can see it looks like 4 legs and it's on its side, but anybody got any clues of what that is?
We refer to it as a horse.
A horse. I mean, that's what my first thought was. Is it a horse?
It's a horse. Yeah, it appears to be sitting down though.
Yes.
So it's quite a relaxed.
It's a relaxed horse. And it's next to the Sheila na gig. That's
Yes.
not a Sheila na gig.
Yeah.
Stickley, he said that this was the conversion of Saul to St. Paul. So he said this was Saul falling from his horse, blinded by a light of God, and then he was converted to St. Paul.
I think what's really ironic is that if there's any saint that's not going to be happy that he's turned into a Sheila na gig, it's going to be St. Paul.
Absolutely.
Who took a chisel or some other tool to that figure next to the horse, possibly once meant to be St. Paul, and turned it into a Sheila na gig, a pagan fertility symbol of a woman exposing her genitalia to all who will look? I can think of reasons why someone might be compelled to add the date and the pagan symbol to the cave, but I can't square in my mind how they could live with themselves afterwards and justify it. Imagine it. You have access to the cave somehow, and your heart is set on it being linked to the Knights Templars and pagan worship. You just know this. You feel it in your bones that it's true, but people just don't believe you. So you take out a tool and you just make some simple adjustments so that no one else can ever be in any doubt as to the origin of this cave. Except you don't realise that if the date was from 1347, it would have been written in Roman numerals, not in Arabic ones we use today. You don't think that the original drawings and early photographs will show the Sheila na gig clothed as a man in a robe. But having made these alterations which convince some visitors, how do you live in the knowledge that it isn't true? You have made those marks. Obviously, it could be 2 separate people who made these adjustments, and maybe it had nothing to do with belief or competing theories about the cave. Maybe someone saw an opportunity to sow more intrigue, mystery and misinformation, which in turn will bring more visitors and more money into the cave. Call me cynical. I am still fascinated by who did this and when, though, from a psychological and sociological point of view. But what is done is done. We cannot undo that Sheila Nagig, nor the date. Our final intriguing mystery is whose body was trapped in Royston Cave. We know that there was a skeleton discovered whilst excavating, and it was discovered really early in the excavation. So we know it is most likely from the early modern period, from any time during or after the cave was sealed. So between the early 16th century and 1742. Matt's intriguing theory that the millstone left at the top of the cave's shaft indicates that it was being used as the market toilet from the mid-16th century until sometime possibly in the 17th, means that there was access to the cave in a way, just a rather unpleasant one. You see, Matt explained to me that this was quite common in the early modern period and late medieval, that millstones would be put over a hole, obviously when the millstone wasn't needed anymore, and as the millstone has a convenient hole in the middle of it, it would be used as a toilet, or maybe possibly for just chucking rubbish down. Did someone throw a body into the market toilet? And if so, why? Or, as Matt speculates, was this a prisoner held in the lockup at the Market Cross who attempted to escape and somehow ended up in the cave? As was earlier mentioned, there were local shafts and chalk pits cut around Royston, and even rumours of tunnels. Could someone, rather than accidentally ending up in the cave, have purposefully gone down there, believing it was an escape route? We'll never know. Reports of missing people or escaped prisoners who vanished from the Market Cross are unlikely to be stumbled across easily. It's not like there were newspapers back then chronicling this kind of information. If only there was a scandal about one of King James's courtiers going missing whilst hunting in Royston, we might be able to speculate on a royal plot or murder. But there is a glimmer of hope about the mystery of the skeleton. In living memory, people in Royston claimed to have teeth from that very skull that was discovered in the cave. And the bones were kept, but we don't know where they were sent. Could a skull and some bones be lying in the back room of a dusty museum or in someone's attic, just waiting to be rediscovered? If you are local to Royston or have connections to the town, and someone in your family claims to have a tooth from a skull that was found in the cave, let us know. That tooth, if from the Royston Cave skeleton, could tell us where the person who it belonged to grew up through isotope testing, and it even might give up the secrets of its DNA. Similarly, if you work in a museum, please do check the labels of any old bones lying around, just in case. You never know, someone listening today might just find a clue that could partially unlock one of the cave's most fascinating mysteries. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to both Emma, the custodian of Royston Cave, and Matt Champion for your time and your expertise. Thank you for being my guides to Royston Cave. I'd also like to say thank you to Emma Butler of the Rue Papers podcast for sharing your experiences with me of working at Mother Shipton's Cave. Now, Emma's podcast, The Rue Papers, is a spooky, fictional concoction of everything that is terrifying and also kind of cozy. You might also recognise one of the voices in that drama because I play the character of Rose. So do go and check out The Rue Papers if you like a bit of spooky drama. I'd also like to say thank you to Fliss for sharing her unique experience at Royston Cave. If any of you listening have had your own experience at Royston Cave that you would like to share with me, I would love to hear from you. You can contact me on social media, just search at Weird in the Wade, or you can email me at weirdinthewade@gmail.com. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to all of you who support Weird in the Wade through Patreon. Yes, Weird in the Wade has a Patreon. Just search Patreon Weird in the Wade. I'll also add a link to the show notes. And people who support Weird in the Wade on Patreon, I couldn't make the podcast without your support. So thank you so much. And if you would like to get extra content every month from Weird in the Wade, sometimes it's a live event, like a live storytelling event. Sometimes it's a bonus episode. Sometimes it's a behind the scenes episode, taking a deeper dive into one of the subjects. For June's Patreon episode, patrons, members of Team Weird, will be able to hear all of Emma's interview about working at Mother Shipton's cave, including some decidedly spooky goings on in the cave. Also, there'll be extra audio that we weren't able to fit into this episode about Royston Cave. Supporting on Patreon means that Weird in the Wade gets regular financial support, but there are other ways that you can support Weird in the Wade. Please do share, just tell people about Weird in the Wade to encourage more people to listen. And you can also give a donation through Ko-fi. That's Ko-fi, 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 Weird in the Wade. And you can give a one-off donation of any amount that you like through Ko-fi. Thank you again for all of you for listening and supporting Weird in the Wade. Weird in the Wade is researched, written, presented and produced by me, Nat Doig. Theme music is by Tess Savagir, and all additional music and sound effects are from Epidemic Sound.